Okay, we're going to begin right on time. It is 12:30. Welcome, everyone. If you plan to leave early, I'm sorry you can't, because we're going to be here because I have a lecture to give today. Every minute counts. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about the syllabus, do some quick introductions, and then we're going to jump right in. Have a seat. I try to start right on time. Doesn't always work that way, but today it's working. So let me just go over the syllabus. All of you should have received the syllabus, and if you haven't received it, you can download it. I sent emails to everyone, which if you can also download it from the website. And let me just go over the syllabus, but before we do anything, okay, I'm making a request. Usually, first day of class, I have two pictures up. One picture of me and one picture of R. Kelly. R. Kelly has an orange jumpsuit. I have my baby in my hand. I am not R. Kelly. R. Kelly spells his name K-E-L-L-Y. I spell my name K-E-L-L-E-Y. If you misspell my name, which some of you have already done, you are associating me with R. Kelly. You can't do that. I'm the other R. Kelly. I'm the one who's free. I'm the one who actually could keep my money, right? So please spell my name right. Please. It's like a historic thing. It's like passed down from ancestors to ancestors. In a very complicated way, if you want to know, come to my office, I'll explain it. Okay, so do that. You will not, well, I don't think you'll be meeting your TAs this week, but either way, I just wanted to say that you have some amazing teaching assistants who you will meet in your discussion sections. It's very important to go to the discussion section. Your TAs are responsible for grading everything except for the group project, which I'll get to. And I can't stress enough how lucky you are to have some of the most brilliant graduate students on this campus working as teaching assistants. They're my peers. They will do all the grading. If you have a complaint about any grades, you can come to me if you want to, but I would not, because people have come to me with complaints. Usually I look at it and I grade a little harder, and so they end up losing points. You don't want to do that. That's the good news, that you have TAs who work with you. The other good news is that we're doing something different this year than I've done in the past. Typically, I would assign essays, sort of take-home essays. You have like a week to do them. You have a couple of prompts. You choose one. But this week, this year, we're not going to do that. You're going to write really, really short, like one-page response papers to discussion, and especially to readings every week. And the reason for that is not that I don't think essays are great, but I'll be honest with you, a lot of you, not all of you, because I don't really know you yet, I'll find out about you soon, but I found students who cheat themselves out of an education by using AI to write their papers for them. And if you don't realize it, AI is not spending as much as your parents are to go to school here. Did you know that? They're making money, which means that each one of you are actually smarter than AI. Do you know how easy it is, if you have a machine brain that could go quickly, to gather a bunch of information to write a paper? That's easy. That's easy. They just do it fast. What's hard is to be imaginative and creative, to see things that no one else has seen, to think deeply beyond the text you're reading, to try to imagine what's possible, right? So if you actually use ChatGPT to write a paper for you, it's like you're just throwing away money. Why would you do that? I know if you were my child and you did that, I'd be like, give me the money back. I'd make you pay me back because you're better than that. So the idea is that you write these short papers. These papers are rough. These papers are responses. These papers could be emotional. These papers could be full of questions, things you don't understand. And the point of them is to really generate discussion with other students and with the TAs. That's the whole point. So you're going to do that. You'll be graded on that. And the grade is not like based on like punctuation or grammar or a thesis sentence. It's just ideas. And the idea is just do it every week. And if you do it every week and you do it on time, then the grade will be good. That's one thing. The other thing that you will be doing, it's on in the syllabus, it's a group project. And this is an experiment I've been doing for the last 15, 20 years. And it always works. And that is that your whole discussion section will be one group. So you're going to do a group project, all 20 students or whatever, will work together to put together some like digital project. I won't talk about it today. There's some description of it in the syllabus, and we'll talk about it much later. And there's some examples on Canvas of previous projects. And I have to say they're spectacular. I've had students do some amazing things on these group projects. And so I expect the same from you. Group projects are group projects. It means that things are not always even. Some people don't always pull their share, but you all get the same grade, right? You need to figure out how to organize yourselves as a community to work together, to divide the labor up. But the idea is that you're going to learn something, and you're going to teach me something in the process. So that's the whole point. And I'm telling you, the group projects are life-changing, life-changing. And trust me, you'll have a great time. Now, what are the benefits of group projects? Well, one is that if your grade is struggling, your grade comes up. Because you can't mess it up. If you have like 16, 15, 17 people working with you, you can't mess it up. They're helping you, okay? So that speaks to my philosophy. My philosophy is that you're at a university. University means universitas. It means the whole. It means that there's nothing that you shouldn't be struggling to learn. Everything should be open. And if that's the case, you should not be doing it in isolation. Does it make any sense to come to universities, spend all the money, and to be in competition with each other? For what? What are you trying to get? A job at Starbucks in the end? No. You're trying to learn together. So I'm asking you to help each other. Help each other. If people are struggling, help them. If you have ideas and you understand things that other people, help them. Help each other. That's the whole point of the university. And if anyone tells you that's cheating, they're lying to you or they're neoliberals, as we'll find out. So I'm really emphasizing help each other, support each other, work together, get to know each other. And the group project would be a lot easier as well. So that's what I want to say about that. Finally, and there's more I could say, but I want to get to this lecture, is pay attention to the syllabus very carefully, because there's some days where there will not be in-class classes, in other words, in-person classes. Next Thursday, for example, on the 5th, I'm going to post the lecture. You go look at it, and then do everything that you normally do, but don't show up to class. The only other days you don't show up will be November 7th and 9th, because I'll be away. But I will post one of the lectures, and the other, you'll be watching a film. So everything will be covered. So don't show up to class if you're not supposed to be here, okay? Any quick questions before I start? Just like housekeeping questions? No, it should be clear, I encourage you also to come to my office hours when I have them. I mean, they're usually kind of fun. I tend to let everyone in at the same time because a lot of the questions tend to be things that other people are thinking about. If you need to speak with me alone, we can do that as well. So, okay, so let's begin. What we're going to do today is we're going to spend some time defining these terms. And all the definitions you have to think about, they're pretty schematic. They're not complete. Because over the course of this class, the definitions will become clearer and clearer and more robust, and also, in some ways, more diffuse, because some of these definitions are highly contested. Now, let's just begin with something basic, and that is, what is capitalism before we get to neoliberalism. And again, I cannot provide an adequate definition of capitalism in 5 minutes or whatever. In fact, I could do a whole course on that. So this is just very, very, cursory observations. And another thing is a word of caution: capitalism is not a coherent or fixed system, and it changes over time. So what is it, basically, in a nutshell? It's an economic system based on private ownership of resources, that is to say land, energy, raw materials, and also manufacturing, the distribution of goods, and the mechanisms of finance. And by the way, what I will be doing is posting a PDF of the PowerPoints on campus after I'm done. I don't like doing that, but people have given me so much sweat about it, so I'm like, whatever. So distribution of goods and the mechanisms of finance, and much of this is concentrated, of course, in the hands of a few. And that is what we know as the capitalist class. Of course, sometimes it's actually concentrated in the hands of the state, and that's a kind of form of state capitalism, which we'll get to another time. Now, this capitalist class extracts surplus from the exploitation of labor to produce goods and services for profit. Workers, on the other hand, have to sell their labor, or their labor is taken from them by coercion, by force. Or if they're on land, they're taken off the land, or they're taken from the land in the case of enslaved people, colonized people, dispossessed, and prisoners. States are important because of their coercive function in the management of labor and capital. This is a very important point because we're going to keep coming back to the role that the state plays in the neoliberal order. Okay? Now, capitalism was oriented toward the global at its inception. It's hard to talk about the globalization of capitalism as if it was national before. It was never purely national. It was always transnational, always moving beyond borders, and emerged as a global system, built not just on enclosure and dispossession within Europe, but on colonialism and slavery. Colonialism and slavery are not precursors to capitalism. They are capitalism. They're foundational to its formation. It's no accident that the global division of, actually, I'll just leave that up there. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about. The global division of labor reflects this longer history. Of course, with the lowest paid, the most precarious workers in the global economy being actually the descendants of slaves, the descendants of colonized people, the descendants of the dispossessed. But again, the irony is that the global character of capital coincides with the rise of nation states. Nation states go back roughly the 18th century. It depends where you're talking about. The creation of nation states, of borders, even regimes of citizenship, as we're going to read about, were direct manifestations of capitalism, of imperialism, of colonialism, of settler colonialism. So before Europeans expanded around the world and took land and human beings and created these kind of settler colonial nations like the United States, for example, or Australia, and then imposed national borders, this is important, there were no illegal immigrants. There was no immigration, as Harsha Walia says, just mobility. In fact, it's really not to the 20th century that you begin to see the actual policing of borders and the kind of structures of citizenship that render whole groups of people illegal. This is a new phenomenon, by the way. I mean, it's not like, people coming over on slave ships of the Mayflower, like, do you got papers? No, it doesn't work that way. So a lot of what we think about the migration system of documentation is new. Now, as Harsha Walia talks about, she talks about border imperialism. And by that, she's referring to borders as ordering technologies of the world used to maintain imperial power, to criminalize migration, that is to make people criminal, illegal, to produce and uphold a racialized hierarchy of citizenship, and also to facilitate state-mediated exploitation of labor. That's a mouthful, but this is just a kind of definition that you're going to come back to again that's actually in the text when you read it. And it's not as complicated as it seems, but these are the things that border imperialism does, and this is what borders do. And that's part of what we're going to talk about, not today, but throughout the course. Now, having said this, this also means that just as capitalism was global from the outset, it also means that capitalism was never separate from race and gender. So we could talk about gendered capitalism. We could talk about racial capitalism. We could talk about gendered racial capitalism. Okay? And I'm going to talk about racial capitalism. And it's a key word we're going to use over and over again, and I'm going to mention it here. So what is racial capitalism? It's simply an indicator. It tells us that race and gender, in addition, are not incidental. They're not accidental features of the global capitalist order. They're not the things that get in the way. It's not like we want pure capitalism and racial capitalism is a separate thing. All capitalism is racial, in that what it does is that the regimes in which capitalism emerge are already race and gendered. You know, so from its inception, what capitalism does is it extracts surplus and structures value by assigning differential value to human beings. So there's some people are considered more valuable than others based on a mythology around race. It's not about genetics at all. It's not about that at all. It's not scientific. These are social constructions, social relations. So if you call a bunch of people primitive, and then you say, therefore, they're only capable of doing so much, you've basically used a kind of differential definition to determine their value. And that determines wages. That determines whether they have access to property. It determines whether they have access to the vote. You know, and we're going to talk a lot about the United States, but that is what we talk about when we talk about racial capitalism. And again, it's not just a type of capitalism. So how do we think about structuring value by assigning differential value to human life and labor? Well, through things like land enclosure, through slavery, through land dispossession and displacement, through predatory lending, through taxation, through disenfranchisement, through war, through border imperialism, as I just suggested before, through the category of migrant labor, for example. Government policies that suppress wages, that create differential wages based on where you live, or where you come from, or how much education you have, which sometimes is determined by race if you don't have access to certain kinds of educational institutions. Determines property values, as we're going to find out. And on and on. We could talk about access to public accommodations and better schools, and also the way in which racial capitalism subsidizes white wealth accumulation. So having said that, we're going to come back to that as well. These are just definitions. Capitalism changes. It's not a single fixed system. It's very dynamic, right? It's constantly changing. In fact, it combines different mechanisms and subsystems, and therefore capitalism is always uneven. It's always unstable in many ways. Its productive capacity shifts. And that's why we have these categories of Fordism, for example, or Keynesianism, or neoliberalism, which we're going to focus on for this course. Now, not being stable also means capitalism as a system is never completely stable. It is prone to periodic crises, since the rate of profit inevitably falls. And in fact, by the way, this is not Marx's idea. This is, Marx has actually argued that, but before him, Adam Smith said the same thing, David Ricardo said the same thing. Why it falls is not the focus of the course or at the moment, but two things you have to keep in mind. One, that the surplus extracted from labor, comes as a result of all kinds of things. Capitalists try to diminish the labor costs by using things like machines, for example, or technology. And when you reduce the labor input into any kind of commodity, the rate of profit falls for lots of different reasons. One just has to do with simply, you're basically making a whole category of unemployed people who can't buy the products you're producing, And so that's one factor. The other factor is that capital has to always circulate. If it doesn't circulate, the system collapses. So don't get confused. We live in a world where people love shiny objects. They love the fact that, someone has a completely gold-plated Ferrari. Well, that's not capital circulating. Driving around the streets is not circulation of capital, in an expensive car. If it doesn't circulate, you end up with crises, with recessions and depressions. Consumption, ostentations, none of that stuff really matters. A measure of value and a means of exchange, like money, for example, doesn't always equal capital. This is not a course on theories of money, though we're going to talk about monetary theory. But at some point, I just want you to keep this in mind about how crises in capitalism are created, because crises are partly what created the conditions for neoliberalism in the first place. So let me just reiterate my point very quickly by just talking about 3 different kinds of crises that we could talk about, and then we're going to move on to definitions of neoliberalism. Okay, so there's 3 different kinds of crises. One is the cyclical crisis. Occurs, regularly, pretty much clockwork, about every decade or so. Usually a recession that acts as a kind of self-correcting mechanisms. There's no need for major restructuring of the system. And the fact is, if anyone thinks that it doesn't exist, just look at history. We've had periodic crises throughout global history, let alone US history. So that's just a fact. A structural crisis is a little different. It reflects a much deeper set of contradictions and requires major restructuring of the system. The 2008, 2007, 2008 crisis, for example, was one. It usually requires major state interventions or interventions from some kind of supranational organizations like the World Bank or the IMF. For example, the global crisis of the 1930s, the Great Depression, was a structural crisis. It required the New Deal and all kinds of state management models around the world, not just in the United States, but all throughout Europe, in the Soviet Union at the time, to try to fix the problem. And it gave rise to a new sort of formation of capitalist production and trade, and that is the Keynesian welfare warfare state, which is a more redistributive model of capitalism. And we'll get to that later, but that's just an example. Finally, there's a kind of systemic crisis, which doesn't really happen much, and I can't say it's happened even recently, but it's a major, major crisis that involves replacement of a system by an entirely new system. Or it could just lead to a system collapse. Every structural crisis opens up the possibility of a systemic crisis. But, and this is really important, what happens in response is not determined by some kind of economic laws, nor is it inevitable. Like, we don't subscribe to the idea that these laws are kind of produce certain inevitable consequences or outcomes. That's not true. It depends on the response of social and political forces to that crisis. It depends on kind of historical contingencies. In other words, people, movements make a difference. State policies make a difference. Organized labor makes a difference. Sometimes it could redirect a crisis. And it's not clear where it's going to go. Okay? And these kinds of moments are called conjunctural crises. It's a conjuncture where things could change dramatically. Okay, if you don't understand any of this, don't worry about it, because we're going to come back to it through examples. Let's get to the thing that you really need to focus on, and what is neoliberalism. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this definition and use an example to illustrate it. So let's begin with defining neoliberalism. Okay, it cannot be easily defined at all, in part because it's been used as an epithet. It's used to characterize the current political in economic zeitgeist. It's declared dead, it's declared living, it's declared, everything is neoliberal. It's used as some kind of vague descriptor for marking this era that we're living in of deep inequality, and it's really defined. So we're going to try to define it, okay? But on the one hand, we have to think as we define it that there is a thing called neoliberalism. There is a set of ideas that have its origins really in the post-First World War period. And we're going to talk about that next week, I think, Thursday, or if not the following. And what the neoliberals were trying to do coming out of Austria, coming out of Switzerland, was to kind of reorganize the international economic order based on things like the elimination of tariffs, open borders, right? Extreme free market principles, the erection of international institutions to manage global political and economic affairs in a particular way. We're going to get to that. And this is important because I know open borders seems like, oh, that's not neoliberal, but it is. It is. There are reasons why those people who end up supporting neoliberal policies push against open borders. But initially, the idea was that labor should move and capital should move without any limits. Of course, that changes over time. So much of the course that we're going to talk about balancing the understanding of what neoliberal thinkers actually believe, their utopian ideals, including libertarians, and the spread of neoliberal logic and ideology into the fabric of everyday life, the way that we all think like neoliberals. And sometimes those things don't go together. And just like capitalism is always changing, neoliberalism is always changing. And then third, we're going to look at the history of actually existing neoliberalism, or what we will call the neoliberal order, okay? Now, despite all the books and articles declaring the death of neoliberalism, it's not clear that we're ready to kind of write the epitaph, and that's something we're going to end up talking about toward the end, whether or not it's over or dead. The question of what aspects of neoliberal thought actually sort of lived or became policy is a matter of contention. And the ideas of self-proclaimed neoliberals, who were not always in agreement, and this is something we're going to talk about as well, sometimes contradict the ideas and policies behind the current order. So, and again, that's just preparing you for the specifics that we're going to talk about throughout the course. So what is our definition? Here's a list of things. Okay, neoliberalism is a set of economic and social theories with solid roots in a certain brand of libertarianism, professing that free markets, that free trade, that reduced or no state regulations whatsoever, and the privatization of virtually every sphere of social and economic life, not every sphere, but almost every sphere, that these are the best way to structure society based on these free market principles. Fundamentally, the ideology of neoliberalism is founded on an idealized vision of market rule, of liberal freedoms based on 19th century liberalism, on competitive individualism, and with a deep, deep, deep antithesis to social redistribution and social solidarity. That is to say, the idea that you could redistribute wealth, or resources is anathema. It's every person for themselves. It's competition that would automatically lead to some redistribution based on their principles. And the other thing, no solidarity. That is to say, although capital has solidarity, we'll get to that, but labor should not. Individual labor should be individual capitals. Okay? Now, this idealized market-driven world is imagined as unencumbered from regulatory constraints of the state. That is state interference. In practice, though, it's a different story. It very often entails the significant intensification of coercive or proactive or invasive forms of state intervention. And we're going to give an example of it today in order to buttress the market rule and to discipline any kind of unruly subjects, like labor, for example, and also to manage contradictions and crises. So it's not a free market. The state is brought in to manage things that the market cannot manage and to make things right. And we're going to talk about that a lot. So part of the myth promoted by neoliberals is that the first liberals never imagined the government playing a large role in managing or regulating economic activity. The most extreme elements of neoliberals proclaim the elimination of government altogether. Most don't say that, but some do, or at least a limited, or that we limit the role of government to domestic or national security. But in truth, their policies require government intervention all the time. Neoliberals do not reject the state, rather they are anti-regulation, anti-safety net. Safety net means for people who don't have means to support themselves, welfare, for example, or unemployment insurance. That's a safety net. They're against the safety net. They're against protections for the most vulnerable people, except for, and it also ends up being against, ironically, their anti-reproductive rights, which is a state invasion of people's privacy, ironically. Only the most extreme libertarians are for the right of women and pregnant people to choose their path, right? So what does the state do? The state, in this neoliberal order, essentially is supposed to play a role in, say, making lands and resources available for private ownership. That's privatizing land, or using eminent domain to take some land and make it private for investment. For providing infrastructure to facilitate the exploitation of such resources, moving goods and services, for example, opening up new zones for housing, retail, all paid for with what? Public funds. How do these public funds come about? Through tax abatements, through subsidies, through eminent domain. That is the transfer of public taxpayers' money to support capital in these endeavors. So again, it's not like the state doesn't exist or the state doesn't provide resources. And most importantly, for our purposes today, we can get to it, to bail out private industry when risk, when their risk will presumably adversely affect the whole economy. So for example, the arms industry has had a consistent subsidy from the government forever. They pay more than what the arms are worth as a way to prop up the military industry. So the other thing is that the state is expected to use, again, through public funds, the police and military to protect property, to wage war, to protect economic interests, to police the globe, to suppress strikes and protests, and, as you're going to read about, to police borders. And when I say borders, not just national borders, not just the borders to the south of us or sea borders, but borders surrounding America's impoverished ghettos, barrios, reservations, and any territory with high concentrations of subjugated communities. So that said, there are 7 kind of features or objectives of neoliberalism. 1, the objective behind these policies is to maximize profits by driving down labor costs. And how to do that? You could do it through outsourcing. We're going to talk about what that means throughout the course. Exploiting unprotected foreign labor through migrant labor regimes, weakening trade unions, imposing free trade policies, shifting manufacturing operations away from the urban cores to outside, to suburbs, or to out to the south, or to outside the country altogether. to take advantage of lower wages through maquiladoras and that sort of thing. Dismantling the welfare state, that's a social safety net. Deregulation, eroding government capacities, eroding the protections for the most vulnerable, which includes enabling other forms of unfree labor, and also through structural adjustment policies in the global south that lowered labor costs. Another feature is monetary and fiscal, revolutionizing monetary policies, fiscal policies, which is to say taxes, and financial policies as a means of promoting unregulated free market activity. Cutting taxes, of course, for corporations is a big one, an obvious one. Number 4, financialization. And we're going to talk about all these things throughout the course, so don't panic if you don't understand them. Financialization of the economy. It refers to the shift toward financial channels rather than the kind of productive activities as a source of profit making. This does not mean, however, that the financial sector has overtaken production or manufacturing. They're intertwined. It's not like they're competing, they're intertwined. Finance fuels the circulation of commodities as well as services. We have the shrinking of federal domestic spending and transferring the burden of that social spending onto states and cities. And this is going to happen at the very moment when homeowners are pushing to lower property taxes. And we're going to talk about that later, tax revolt. The last 2, expanding the national security state. Again, immense state expenditures on behalf of neoliberal interests. And what I mean by this is like military, covert operations, domestic policing, surveillance, prisons, militarized border. And there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about. Okay, and finally, and we're seeing this right now, there's a push to dismantle democratic institutions, forms of popular power, like collective bargaining rights. See, we think of democracy as votes. The vote is just one thing. But collective bargaining rights is a form of democracy. And of course, there's voter suppression laws and other coercive practices. Now, what I want to do is to look at most of these things and use one example. Because what I do is I talk about what's happening right now. Now, how many of you are aware that the UAW is on strike right now? Raise your hand. So everybody, except for the people who are trying to buy stuff on Temu, right? And it's not worth it, trust me. My daughter buys that stuff, it's just cheap, falls apart. So everyone pretty much knows that there's a strike. So you're following the strike. You should also know that the UAW is the same union that our teaching assistants are members of. They're local 2865 UAW. And so there's a lot that we can think about in terms of what the UAW represents. So the auto workers are striking the big 3 automakers. I'm going to leave that up there. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, which used to be, or bought up Chrysler. And they have these are the demands, 40% increase in wages in a 32-hour work week, cost of living adjustment, they're called COLA, which union leaders have actually given up as part of concessions to automakers back in the 2008 financial crisis. The return of defined benefit pension plans. What that means is that it's a pension plan in which you get a steady payment until you die. In 2008, the union agreed to accept 401ks to which the company contributes, some money, you contribute some, but it's often not enough to live on and subject to what? Market fluctuations. They want an end to the 2-tiered wage system. I'll talk about that. What that basically means is that new hires will come in and they would be paid significantly less than those who have seniority. So if the prevailing wage is $32 an hour, they may come in at $15 an hour. And so if a 2-tiered system, they said we want to end to that. They want to protect workers, especially as plants shift to electric vehicles. includes, some form of compensation in the event that a plant closes. They want to support unionized workers in battery manufacturing plants, and also give them the right to strike over plant closures. So why these particular demands? Well, Ford, GM, Stellantis made at least $250 billion in profits over the past decade. $21 billion this year alone. A 40% increase doesn't come close to that amount of money. General Motors, and by the way, it's a 40% over 4 years. General Motors CEO, Mary Barra, the highest paid CEO among the big three, made nearly $29 million in 2022 alone. Now, these are significant demands, and part of the reason they're emerging now is because we have new leadership that came out of a caucus called Unite All Workers for Democracy. Now, how did we get here? And this is really the story of neoliberalism. We have to begin with the fact, very briefly, that the UAW was born out of militant strikes in 1936-37. They became one of the most powerful unions in the country because of the rank and file. And these are pictures. One is a picture of a sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, where they sat down, took over the factory. Another one is the Battle of the Overpass, 1937, where the police came and attacked striking workers. But they were able to win. Now, here's the thing. After World War II, and we're going to talk about this later with the Taft-Hartley bill, there was a kind of attack on labor with the Cold War. Anti-communism was used to weaken collective bargaining and destroy more of the militant left-wing unions. In 1945, the UAW went on strike for a 30% increase. After the war, they didn't win that strike. And they were striking because during World War II, there were wage freezes, and they had to sign a no-strike pledge. So now, the end of the war is over, they want to increase their wages. But in 1950, Walter Reuther, who was a UAW leader, signed this landmark contract that became known as the Treaty of Detroit. And it was a contract between the three big auto industries and the UAW. And it's a very, very important sort of landmark contract. And let me explain what it does. It was important because it institutionalized collective bargaining. In other words, they decided, the owners like, we're not going to fight you anymore. We're going to have peace. And so collective bargaining became something accepted, but it tied wages and benefits to productivity and growth. So if the company goes down, they could adjust wages accordingly, but the company didn't. Workers won annual raises, they got a cost of living allowance, they got health care, they got vacation time, they got pension, defined pension benefits. But the workers had to agree, and this is the thing, it's a kind of devil's bargain. They had to agree to no strikes over 5 years. They gave up the right to bargain over certain issues, especially workplace issues, and it limited the rank and file power within the UAW. So the point was to establish this peace between labor and industry through consumerism, through consumption, rather than workers' control. And let me explain what I mean by that. A lot of the strikes that took place before 1945 were over workplace control. They wanted to basically have some control over the pace of work, so it wouldn't be speed-ups. Workers want to have control over the introduction of technology. They wanted control over the length of the working day. So they gave all that up in order to become middle class, to make enough money to buy houses, a middle class lifestyle, which is a great achievement on the part of the UAW. But what happened was the industry continued to reap huge profits, and they never had to worry about work stoppages. They didn't have to worry about strikes, at least initially. And in fact, even Fortune magazine was like, oh, this is a bargain for the industry. It's a good deal for the companies. They called it an affirmation of the free enterprise system, and that GM may have paid $1 billion for peace, but it got a bargain. So the idea was to maintain this peace, but not all workers benefited equally. Black workers were still subject to segmented occupational structure, in which they were concentrated in some of the worst and most difficult jobs, like the foundry, for example, where a lot of black workers were concentrated. Very hard work. And they got wage increases. I don't want to say they didn't, but they were not always allowed to advance in terms of seniority. And unlike their white co-workers, they face other kinds of discrimination. In the housing market, for example, obtaining mortgages, building equity, as white workers were able to move to segregated suburbs outside of Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, Grand Rapids, Michigan, a lot of black workers could not, because those were barred from moving into those neighborhoods. And the value of their homes, when they could buy homes, did not appreciate the same way. So, in 1967, actually I think, I don't have a, yeah, I have a slide for this. So 1967, Detroit blows up. The huge uprising sparked by police brutality, sparked by poverty, and deteriorating conditions, and it shapes the black working class in Detroit. It was the largest incident of civil unrest in U.S. history up to that point. Then, the following year, May 1968, partly inspired by the 67 uprising, 4,000 black and some Arab American workers, auto workers, walked off the job at the Dodge main plant, and they waged what's called a wildcat strike. A wildcat strike means a strike's not authorized. So what did? They broke the Treaty of Detroit. UAW leadership was like, you can't do that. But they're saying, we can, because the speed up is too much for us. And you basically stripped our ability to make any decisions. So they go out on strike. They fighting the union, and then other plants went on strike. The Eldon Avenue Gear and Axle plant, the Ford Revolutionary Union movement was formed out of the Ford plant going on strike. So then Drum was formed, which is called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, black-led. Together, all these different union movements formed the League of Black Revolutionary Workers. And their demands were very specific. They wanted safer workplaces. And by the way, be clear, don't get it confused. They're not asking for safer workplaces for black workers. They were asking for safer working conditions for all workers. It just so happens that they were the ones affected in a direct way. They wanted lower production demands. They wanted to slow down the pace of work. They wanted to end racist hiring practices. And so eventually, the League comes in conflict with the UAW leadership. They run people for office to try to become part of the Board of Trustees. The UAW leadership calls the police in Detroit to come and break up drum meetings, calls the police to evict them from the UAW headquarters, and basically wage a campaign of intimidation to make sure that the drum representative didn't get on the Board of Trustees. So I want to just end with this part and then get to the story of Flint real quickly, because I want you to realize what just happened. The Treaty of Detroit was supposed to maintain peace. Black workers were super exploited, so they said, no peace. We're going to fight to try to transform the working conditions. The white workers didn't show up. They didn't support them. What they were fighting for was for all workers. But the white workers end up supporting the UAW brass. Some white workers supported them, but most didn't. And they lost the opportunity to fight for better working conditions, for control of the plant, for freedom for all workers, and a critique of capitalism. So, now turn to the story of Flint, which is much of the same but slightly different. In 1960, Flint, Michigan was like the place to be. It had the highest per capita incomes in the United States. General Motors was the main employer. And workers won very strong wages and job protections because of the intense struggles of the union and the post-war growth of the US economy. And of course, the Treaty of Detroit helped consolidate that. But as we shall see later in the course, the first principle of neoliberalism, as I mentioned, right, which is also a principle of capitalism, is to maximize profits by driving down labor costs through outsourcing, exploiting unprotected foreign labor, weakening trade unions, etc. So we're going to examine this in some detail. But here's what happens. Outsourcing. As the manufacturing processes become more mobile, General Motors and Ford begins to leave Michigan. And why are they doing this? Well, partly because there's competition with other foreign car manufacturers. The Japanese are making cars, high-quality cars that are competing. The Germans. So now sales are going down, and GM execs are trying to figure out what to do. So they start to leave. They go to Mexico. They go to South Africa. They go to Brazil, where they're building cars, and jobs are disappearing. And they could do this through free trade agreements. They paid even less in taxes and duties. They set up shop in places where there's vulnerability to labor, because there were places where unions were weak, environmental policies were also weak, and that sort of thing. In order for GM to, let me say it differently. In order for Flint to try to get GM to come back and rebuild, the state of Michigan and the city began offering General Motors huge tax cuts. Huge tax cuts. Some cases, and this is very important, they allowed General Motors immunity from any legal consequences for producing defective vehicles. So you can't sue them, okay? And catch this, for polluting the Flint River. If you know anything about the Flint River crisis, and that's another thing we're going to actually spend time talking about later in the quarter, the Flint River ended up being badly polluted. There was a shift from this water source from the Detroit River to the Flint River, and that caused havoc, poisoning, lead poisoning, and all kinds of things that happened, which we're going to deal with later. But I want to emphasize that in order to keep GM, the city and the state said you have the right to pollute. GM made billions in profits. And where did the money go? Not to the city, went to the shareholders. But jobs still disappeared through outsourcing, through reduced shifts, and through automation. Now, two factors are important. Again, competition with automakers elsewhere and the economic crisis of the 1970s. So all told, between 1979 and 2010, Flint lost 87.5% of its manufacturing jobs. Just reflect on that for a second. 87.5% of its manufacturing jobs. How did Flint become a black poor city? That's how. Flint didn't look like that in 1960 or 65 or even 1970. So with GM shares losing value, like many US manufacturing firms, they began to diversify. And this is a neoliberal move as well. The CEO, Thomas Murphy, was like, General Motors is not in the business of making cars, it is in the business of making money. So what do? They turned to finance. General Motors entered the consumer finance market, selling insurance packages, providing banking services, and mortgages, and even home equity loans to members of the public, right? By 1999, GM was involved in what? Selling subprime mortgages. If you don't know what that is, we will spend some time talking about it later. But this comes full circle. So GM is selling subprime mortgages to people, many of whom had been fired from GM, who'd been building cars before, who didn't have the money to pay back if the price went up. They would securitize the debt, then sell it off for profit, the same type of loans that were ultimately responsible for triggering the post-2007 global financial crisis, and also the bankruptcy of GM itself. Now, of course, what's the result? The result is predatory lending. That is, mortgage companies backed by the federal government that targeted low and middle income people of color, working people losing their homes as well as their jobs. And again, we're going to talk more about this later in the course. And when the variable interest rates kind of ballooned on the mortgages, the housing market collapsed. And this had a domino effect on the economy. That domino effect left cities like Flint, Michigan, with just a fraction of the kind of tax revenue they needed to run the city. So they not only lost property taxes from all the housing, from all the home foreclosures caused by the housing crisis, but the city continued to give big tax breaks to the very corporations that actually fleeced the city. And the city of Flint fell deeper into debt. And by the way, that debt, they tried to cover that debt by switching the water source from the Detroit River to the Flint River, which then led to all that poisoning and whatnot, which we're going to talk about. So again, this all relates to why there's a strike right now. Now, in order to come out of the debt, right, as you could see, they privatized public assets in order to attract investment capital. What does that mean? It means public lands were sold off to developers. It means water rates increased. There was a push to privatize water. Downtown redevelopment schemes were encouraged using public funding and substantial tax breaks to private firms to finance new buildings, to build skyscrapers that were empty, parking lots that were empty. And none of these ventures revitalized downtown economy or revitalized Flint itself. And Flint was in debt. Now, while all this is happening, I forgot to put that up there, you have the liberalization, the neoliberalization that's affecting the UAW. So beginning in the 1990s, under these circumstances of capital flight, of the decline of manufacturing, UAW was so beaten down that they began to accept the two-tiered system. In the 90s, some things you're going to read, it'll say, oh yeah, 2007 was when the two-tier system started. That's not true. It actually started in 1996 with Ford. They implemented it back then. So the two-tiered system meant that all the new workers were making a lot less money. Ford workers are making like a lot less, except if you have seniority. The 2007 strike did make a difference, however. Okay? So with the 2007 strike, UAW basically got defeated. And they negotiated a terrible contract that included a 4-year wage freeze, which then ended up reducing the average hourly wages for workers, real wages, in manufacturing motor vehicles and parts. It dropped by more than 20%. So in the past 2 decades, when adjusted for inflation, it was like a substantial loss of wages, which the UAW is trying to catch up to now. Then you have 2002, 2008, 2009, the bailouts of the auto industry. The first one was George Bush, where the auto industry received $81 billion. So again, goes back to my definition of neoliberalism. The state's role, in fact, is to cover for companies who are unwilling to cover the risk. In other words, bail out companies using public funds when the risk puts them in jeopardy. Now, follow me here. Bush gives about $81 billion to the auto industry, Obama about $10 billion, and GM alone received $51 billion in public funds. And as part of the deal, 40% of the workforce for GM, that is the tier 2 workers, the ones who came in at lower wages, had to take a 50% pay cut. So they were making as little as $15 an hour. So these were so-called temp workers, the bottom tier. And guess what? A large percentage of those second-tier workers are black and brown. Again, we got racial capitalism at work. So what happened next? Well, we know what happened. GM made $35 billion in North American profits and paid almost no federal taxes. In 2019, UAW goes on strike again. They strike 3 GM plants representing about 48,000 workers, and they settled after 40 days, a very bad settlement. And what was the settlement? Over 4 years, there was a 3% increase in the base salary, 3% over 4 years. And in fact, only years 2 and 4, they would get like these bonuses, to support full-time employees. Temporary workers received like $4,500. And of course, part of the agreement was to convince the auto industry, GM in particular, to invest in plants that were about to close. Now, this brings us to where we are right now. That is a militant caucus within the UAW. It was a very small group that began pushing the end of two-tier system. And they fought, and now they are in the driver's seat. So this is a very important turning point to see what's going to happen next, okay? But there's one part of the story we have to end with. The final part, and I think, I don't have a slide, I have a picture, I'm going to show you in a second, but I mentioned the electric vehicles transition. Well, the UAW was looking to include workers at electric vehicle battery factories that service many of the manufacturers. In other words, they're not they may be partly owned by auto companies, manufacturers, but they're also some are independent. So they want to basically include all those battery workers, manufacturers. And the idea was we want to push toward a green economy. Isn't that a good thing? Yes, of course it's a good thing, right? In fact, many of the battery factories employed large numbers of black labor, but they were paid a lot less, $16, $17 an hour. But here's the catch. And you know this. Batteries for phones and electric vehicles and the like need cobalt. Cobalt is what keeps the batteries from overheating. Cobalt comes from heterogenite. Heterogenite comes from mostly Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Most of it's extracted in industrial mines owned mostly by Chinese capital, some US capital. And then there are also what's called artisanal diggers. That is, those people, individuals who try to pull the heterogenite out of the ground themselves, which they sell to traders who then sell to the Chinese companies. And they're making like $2 a day doing this very dangerous work, often child labor, often with babies. In other words, the batteries that you have and we all have in our phones, the batteries that are being used for our electric cars, the things that are giving us green energy are at the cost of human life in Central Africa. And we're going to talk about Congo because the Katanga region has been the source of all these fights over capital, going back to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. We're going to talk about that. But we're talking about a nation state that has a history of diamond, gold, uranium, all kinds of mineral wealth. It's, if you just would count the mineral wealth in Congo, it's the richest nation in the world. But it doesn't matter because they don't control that wealth. And this, again, brings us back to the problems of the neoliberal order, that this is how we get the batteries. So that means no matter what we talk about in terms of a green economy and the benefits of moving toward green energy, if there's not an organization of the working classes in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo and DRC, then the struggle's not over. It's not enough to fight in the auto plants. And that's to say, in the final statement, is that you can't understand anything, if you don't look at how the world's connected. We think we're winning something here at the expense of something else. So although this is like a US history course, it's not really that. I was lying to you. We're going to talk mostly about the US, but also about the whole world and the connections to them. So that's what I want to say. We've got 7 minutes. Any questions, comments, thoughts? This is your time. Because I said a lot of stuff. And I know you don't understand all. Yes? Oh, you know what? contact your TA, because we're trying to make sure everyone has discussion. Some may be meeting, some may not be. But the most important thing is next week for sure. But is there a question? Because if this is discussion right now. It's a big discussion. Yes?
I have a question about the 1968 and what happened in Detroit and all that. Did any of that have to do with MLK dying? Because I know he died like a month right before that.
Right. The question is, did MLK's assassination have anything to do with the Wildcat strikes in May '68? It was a factor, but no. Those strikes had been organized or prepared long before King's assassination. General Baker was one of the leaders of the strike, and they've been planning this for a while. The key thing, though, is the '67 uprising, which was a year before King's. That had a huge role in empowering workers to basically take this action. Yes, you had your hand.
What's the difference between neoliberalism and liberalism?
Oh, good question. The difference between neoliberalism and liberalism. Tuesday. I'm going to lay it all out. Tuesday is just about what is liberalism. So, yes?
How important do you think the president's visit and striking with the workers was to advance their causes this week?
That's a really good question. And the jury's kind of out. First of all, I'm not a fan of Democrats or Republicans, just so you know that. And we're going to learn about it. However, that was really significant of any sitting president to do that. And I have to give Biden huge credit. My fear, though, is how do we understand a worker's consciousness in a neoliberal era where fear of migration will convince non-union labor and union to vote for Trump rather than vote for Biden, in part not because Trump has better labor policies, but if you continue to push an agenda that says that I'm going to protect you I'm going to protect the border and protect you and protect your jobs, even though you're going to get paid less, that actually works. And that's the question at hand. The idea that Donald Trump would actually go to a non-union shop to spout his politics is amazing, but that's what's so scary about the world we're living in. So you had your hand up. Yes?
So it seems like the current trend of strikes is like they are progressively getting worse in terms of settlements. Would you say that it's like a current trend, like it's going downwards?
So when you say downwards in terms of the settlement or downwards in terms of? Yeah, no, that's a good question. First of all, if the UAW wins, it's going to change the game, much like the Treaty of Detroit did the same thing. Treaty of Detroit set up a pattern of collective bargaining that almost all industries use. If the UAW wins, it's going to basically force a lot of companies to capitulate. And that was the strategy. Sean Fain and the caucus was like, we're not fighting for auto workers. We're fighting for the whole working class. So there have been victories, but part of what we're seeing is not a recent downward trend, but 40 years of a downward trend. And that's the thing that's key. So, it depends what's going to happen. One last, let's see. Okay, let me just make sure, because I want to get I'm going to take two, because I want to get a good gender balance. Yes?
So earlier in the beginning of the lecture, you said that capitalism and all capitalism is racial. But considering that capitalism also exists in homogeneous countries where division of labor and class division is created without regard for race, then when you said all capitalism is racial, are you referring to situations like what you just mentioned about the Congo where black labor is exploited for the sake of global capitalism?
Well, think of the sequence. If all capitalism is global, then it doesn't matter whether or not a nation is heterogeneous. And the thing is, heterogeneity is kind of a tricky idea, because when we talk about race, we're not talking about only traditional definitions. You can think of Slavic people as racialized, right?
Right.
And part of that's where the word the Slav comes from, slave. And so racialization doesn't always mean about color or anything. It's about the subordination of people based on difference. Now, let's take Belgium. People think of Belgium as like a pretty homogenous country. But what did Belgium have? It had the Congo. The Congo was very much fundamental to its economy. And the violence that produced the kind of wealth that came into Belgium that benefited King Leopold and some, it's different. So when I say it's always racial, part of it is that the migrant regimes that we talk about, the fact that you have migration or migrants who are deemed fundamentally different, not just part of a working class, that is part of the way racial capitalism functions. And finally, racial doesn't always mean difference in outside. It also means the benefit of those people who are homogenous. For example, whiteness, Europeanness becomes ways to justify a two-tiered system of labor. Like certain groups get certain things. And that's what I mean by that. And finally, we have to really get out of the thinking of what race is, because race is this dynamic thing that doesn't always attach to genes or skin color or even traditional ways of thinking. And it's really thinking about the way that difference functions to reduce value, to shape value of human life and labor. And that's the key thing, Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, if there's no one, oh yes, we got time. You, and then we'll end. Yeah.
So, was it a systemic crisis that launched like feudalism and capitalism? And if so, what crisis was that?
Okay, this is a question I can't really answer in the time we have, which is, was it a systemic crisis that shifted feudalism to capitalism? There's a lot of factors. One could argue that it was systemic, definitely. The problem is, and we're at UCLA, where one of the most important thinkers on the debate about the transition was Robert Brenner. And the transition wasn't an immediate, swift process. It was, in fact, capitalism's origins go way, way back. And it's not the scope of this class to do that, but it goes back even before. And there's a really great book by Ellen Woods that tells the story very differently about the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And it breaks away from the idea that there's a single systemic crisis that opened up the pathway. It's a multiple set of crises that happen. Some were not crises, new markets and stuff. So I think my watch, let me just make sure I got time. Oh yeah, I got your last one. Got three.
In the current American political climate, that a workers' party founded in proletarian solidarity is a feasible political project?
See, you're a plant.
You got me.
So the question is, in the current political climate, is it feasible to have a workers' party based on kind of proletarian solidarity? I can't answer that question. I mean, I have my own opinions, but it's a great question, and I think everyone should think about it, because part of what we're going to do throughout this course is ask over time, what is the political configurations of what's possible, right? So thinking about it today versus thinking about it in the 1930s versus thinking about it in the 1970s, all this is really, really important. So I think it really needs to be on the table as a question. And then as a question, the final thing is, there's a question of what the conditions provide, and there's a question of what consciousness is there. So a neoliberal way of thinking is one where you don't think about solidarity at all, right? And so part of the barriers to a kind of workers' party is that way of thinking. How do you get past that? Okay, so I will see you all Tuesday.